Fat Karen called Judge Judy grandma in open court. What happened 12 seconds later didn't just end her case, it ended her entire world. But here's what nobody saw coming. The insult wasn't even the worst part. What Karen said next made even her own lawyer walk out of the courtroom. The courtroom on that Tuesday afternoon felt different from the moment the doors opened. There was an electricity in the air, the kind that makes your skin prickle with anticipation before a storm breaks. The benches were packed tighter than usual, shoulder to shoulder with spectators who'd heard whispers that today's docket had a case worth watching. They weren't wrong. The wood-paneled walls of Stage 52 at Sunset Bronson Studios seemed to close in tighter than normal, the overhead lights casting sharp shadows across the gallery. Every cough echoed, every shuffle of paper sounded like thunder. The bailiff, Petrie Hawkins Bird, stood at his usual post near the judge's bench, his arms crossed, his face its typical mask of professional neutrality. But if you looked close enough, you'd catch it. A slight tension in his jaw, a readiness in his posture. He'd been doing this job long enough to smell trouble before it walked through the door, and trouble was already here, standing at the plaintiff's podium. Before we dive into this incredible case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing where my viewers are around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable cases like this one. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Her name was Sharon Berkowitz, but within 30 seconds of opening her mouth, the entire courtroom would know her by another name entirely. She stood there in a hot pink blazer that was 2 sizes too small, the fabric straining at the buttons like it was fighting for its life. Her bleached blonde hair was teased into a helmet that hadn't moved since 1987, and her makeup was applied with what could only be described as aggressive enthusiasm, foundation caked in the creases of her scowl, lipstick that had bled slightly beyond the lines, false eyelashes that looked like they were trying to escape her face. But it wasn't her appearance that set the tone. It was her energy. She radiated entitlement the way a furnace radiates heat, oppressive and inescapable. Her arms were crossed over her chest. Her weight shifted to one hip in that universal stance of someone who'd spent their entire life demanding to speak to managers. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of disapproval, and her eyes, small and sharp behind too much mascara, darted around the room like she was cataloging everyone's failures. She'd been sighing dramatically since she walked in, loud enough to make sure everyone heard her displeasure at having to be here at all. Next to her stood her lawyer, a young man in his late 20s who looked like he'd graduated law school 3 weeks ago and was already regretting every decision that led him to this moment. His suit was off the rack but pressed within an inch of its life, his tie perfectly knotted, his briefcase gripped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He kept glancing at his client with the expression of a man who'd realized he'd accepted a case from a live grenade. Every few seconds he'd lean toward her, whispering something that was clearly a plea for her to calm down, to follow his advice, to please, for the love of God, not make this worse. She ignored him completely. Across the aisle at the defendant's podium stood Marcus Chen, a quiet man in his 60s with kind eyes and the patience of someone who'd spent decades teaching middle school. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, his hands folded in front of him, his expression one of weary resignation. This was his neighbor, the woman who'd made his life a living nightmare for the past 18 months. The woman who'd called the police on his grandson for riding a bike too loudly. The woman who'd filed complaints about his flower garden being an eyesore. The woman who was now suing him for $5,000 because she claimed his property line fence was encroaching on her yard by 6 inches and causing her emotional distress. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from dealing with unreasonable people for so long that you've stopped being surprised by their capacity for pettiness. His own lawyer, a sharp woman in her 40s with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, stood beside him with a manila folder full of documents that told a very different story than the one Sharon was about to present. She'd been practicing law for 20 years. She'd seen cases like this before, and she knew exactly how this was going to end. Then there was Judge Judy herself. Judith Scheindlin sat elevated at her bench, black robe pressed and perfect, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed the case file in front of her. At 78 years old, she'd presided over more than 12,000 cases in her quarter-century on television. Before that, she'd spent 14 years as a family court prosecutor in New York, and another 14 as a family court judge. She'd seen every scam, every lie, every manipulation tactic that humans could devise. She'd dealt with deadbeat parents, slumlords, con artists, and every flavor of petty criminal and civil offender imaginable. And she suffered none of them gladly. Her reputation preceded her like a weather warning. Tough but fair, sharp as a scalpel, unimpressed by tears, excuses, or theatrics. She had a particular disdain for people who wasted the court's time. who treated the legal system like their personal complaint department, who mistook volume for validity. And as she sat there reading Sharon Berkowitz's complaint with those sharp eyes that missed absolutely nothing, you could see it, the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her finger traced certain passages in the filing that made no legal sense whatsoever, the almost imperceptible shake of her head that suggested she already knew this was going to be a long afternoon. But here's what made Judge Judy different from every other judge on television, every other authority figure people tried to steamroll. She didn't look imposing. She was 5'1" on a good day. Her voice, while clear and sharp, wasn't naturally loud or booming. She didn't have the physical presence of intimidation that some judges wielded like a weapon. She looked, if you didn't know better, like somebody's grandmother, like a woman who might bake cookies on Sundays and knit scarves for her grandchildren, like someone you could maybe, if you were foolish enough, try to push around. And that was Sharon Berkowitz's fatal miscalculation. She looked at Judge Judy and saw an old woman, an obstacle to be overcome with enough attitude and aggression, someone who could be bullied if you just raised your voice loud enough, if you just acted entitled enough, if you just made it clear that you weren't going to back down. Sharon had spent her entire life getting her way through sheer force of obnoxiousness. She'd worn down customer service representatives, intimidated retail workers, and bulldozed through anyone who dared suggest she might be wrong. And she looked at this small woman in the black robe and thought, easy target. The courtroom settled into that peculiar silence that comes right before proceedings begin. When everyone takes their seats and the weight of what's about to happen presses down on the room, the camera operators made their final adjustments. The audience stopped their whispered conversations. Even Sharon's dramatic sighing paused for a moment. Judge Judy removed her reading glasses, set them on the bench with deliberate precision, and looked up at the plaintiff and defendant standing before her. Her face was neutral, professional, giving away nothing. But if you'd spent any time watching her, if you knew the signs, you'd see it in her eyes, a predator's focus, a sharpness that suggested she'd already read this entire situation, and was 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room. The bailiff straightened slightly, recognizing that look. Marcus Chen's lawyer allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. And Sharon Berkowitz, completely oblivious to the fact that she was about to become a cautionary tale, uncrossed her arms and prepared to make her case. Judge Judy's voice cut through the silence, clear and businesslike. State your case. 3 words. Simple, direct. The opening of what should have been a straightforward small claims proceeding. But as Sharon Berkowitz opened her mouth to respond, as that first syllable formed on her lips, dripping with condescension and entitlement, everyone in that courtroom was about to learn the same lesson that 12,000 previous cases had learned before them. You don't mess with Judge Judy, and you definitely don't underestimate her. Sharon Berkowitz took a deep breath, the kind that inflates the chest and announces to everyone in the room that something important is about to be said. She shifted her weight, adjusted her blazer, and looked at Judge Judy with an expression that somehow managed to combine impatience with barely disguised contempt. Your Honor, she began, her voice already carrying that particular tone that customer service workers recognize instantly as the prelude to a nightmare. I'm here today because my neighbor, Mr. Chen, has been ruining my property value and my peace of mind for over a year now. She gestured dramatically toward Marcus, who stood quietly at the defendant's podium, his face unchanged. He put up a fence, she continued, her voice rising slightly, that extends 6 inches onto my property, 6 inches that I paid for, that I own, that he is now using for his ugly chain-link monstrosity. Judge Judy's expression remained neutral, but her pen had started moving across her notepad, quick, efficient strokes that suggested she was cataloging every word. And you have a survey to prove this property line dispute? She asked, her tone professional and measured. Sharon's face flickered with something, annoyance maybe, or frustration that she was being asked to provide actual evidence. Well, she said, I have my survey from when I bought the house. Judge Judy didn't look up from her notes. And does Mr. Chen's fence appear on that survey? No, because he put it up after I moved in, Sharon snapped, her voice getting sharper. Judge Judy's pen stopped moving. She looked up slowly, fixing Sharon with a gaze that would have made a smarter person reconsider their tone. So you have a survey from before the fence was installed? She said carefully, each word precisely placed. Do you have an updated survey showing the fence encroachment? Sharon's jaw tightened. She glanced at her lawyer, who was looking at his shoes like they were the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. I shouldn't need a new survey, she said, her voice climbing another notch. It's obvious to anyone with eyes that his fence is on my property. I can see it. I measured it myself with a tape measure. The courtroom was starting to feel the shift. A few audience members exchanged glances. The bailiff's eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch. Marcus Chen's lawyer had pulled out a document from her folder and was holding it ready, waiting. Judge Judy leaned back slightly in her chair. So you don't have a professional survey showing the alleged encroachment, she stated, Not a question, but a clarification for the record. You have your own measurements with a tape measure. Sharon's face was reddening now. That particular shade that comes right before someone loses control of their temper. Look, she said. And this was the moment. The instant where everything changed. Where her complete lack of judgment and abundance of entitlement collided into a decision that would haunt her forever. Look, Grandma. Maybe if you understood modern property law instead of whatever they taught you back in your day, you'd get why this is so simple. The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Grandma. The courtroom didn't just go silent, it went dead. The kind of silence that follows a car crash, where everyone's brain is still processing what just happened, where shock hasn't quite converted to reaction yet. Judge Judy's face didn't move. Not a muscle. She sat there frozen in that moment. Her hands still resting on her desk, her eyes locked on Sharon with an intensity that should have been a warning. But Sharon, riding high on her own sense of righteousness, didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Because people like Sharon never know when to stop. I mean, no offense, she continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. But maybe someone with more current legal knowledge should be hearing cases about property disputes in 2025. This is technical stuff, modern stuff. Not really in your wheelhouse anymore, right? Her lawyer's hand had come up to his face, covering his mouth and eyes in a gesture of absolute horror. He'd started shaking his head, a tiny movement like he was trying to physically disconnect himself from what was happening. Two audience members gasped audibly. Another whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Marcus Chen's expression had shifted from tired resignation to something like shocked sympathy. Not for himself, but for the woman who'd just committed social suicide. His lawyer had actually taken a step back from her podium, instinctively distancing herself from the blast radius. And Sharon Berkowitz, completely oblivious to the fact that she just detonated a bomb in her own face, pressed forward. "I've been dealing with property issues my whole life," she said, her voice full of that aggressive confidence that comes from never being truly challenged. "I've bought and sold 3 houses. I think I know a little bit about boundary lines. So maybe, Your Honor," she added, somehow making the title sound like an insult, "we could move this along. Some of us have actual jobs to get back to." The bailiff, Petrie Hawkins Bird, had been standing at his post for over 2 decades. He'd seen people insult Judge Judy before. He'd seen people try to lie to her, manipulate her, sweet-talk her, and intimidate her. He'd seen every possible approach to trying to get one over on Judith Scheindlin. And he'd seen every single one of those attempts fail spectacularly. But this was something special. This was a woman who'd not only insulted the judge's age and competence, but had done it with such casual dismissiveness, such absolute certainty that she was in the right, that it almost seemed like performance art. He caught Judge Judy's eye for just a fraction of a second, and in that tiny moment of connection he saw what was coming. And despite his professional composure, despite 20 years of maintaining courtroom decorum, he felt the corners of his mouth twitch with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. Judge Judy still hadn't moved. Her glasses were still on the desk where she'd placed them. Her hands were still folded. Her face was still neutral, blank, giving away absolutely nothing. But something had changed. The temperature in the room had dropped. The air felt thinner, harder to breathe. It was like watching a tsunami pull back from the shore. That moment of eerie calm before the wave crashes down with devastating force. Sharon finally seemed to sense that something wasn't right. Her smug expression faltered. She looked at her lawyer, who was refusing to make eye contact, his face buried in his hands. She looked at Marcus Chen, whose eyes had gone wide with second-hand embarrassment. She looked at the audience, where people were staring at her with expressions ranging from disbelief to anticipation, to something that looked almost like pity. And then she looked back at Judge Judy, who was now slowly, deliberately reaching for her glasses. Not to put them on, just to hold them, to have something in her hands. The gesture was casual, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel about to fall. And Sharon Berkowitz, who'd walked into this courtroom thinking she was going to bully her way to $5,000, suddenly realized with a cold rush of dread that she'd made a terrible, irreversible mistake. Judge Judy held those glasses in her right hand, her fingers wrapped around them with a gentleness that somehow felt more threatening than if she'd slammed them down on the desk. She didn't put them back on. She didn't set them down. She just held them, turning them slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if she were contemplating something far more important than Sharon Berkowitz's property dispute. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. In a courtroom, 15 seconds of absolute silence feels like an eternity. Every breath becomes audible. Every slight movement of fabric sounds like a roar. Someone in the gallery shifted in their seat and the creak of the bench echoed like a gunshot. Sharon's confidence was crumbling in real time, visible in the way her shoulders started to hunch slightly forward, in the way her arms uncrossed and her hands found each other in front of her waist, fingers twisting together nervously. She'd come in here like a bulldozer, and now she was shrinking, getting smaller by the second under the weight of Judge Judy's silence. The small woman at the elevated bench finally moved. Not dramatically. Not with any theatrical flourish. She simply leaned forward just a few inches, and the entire courtroom leaned with her, drawn in by the gravitational pull of what was about to happen. Her eyes, sharp and dark and absolutely merciless, locked onto Sharon's face like a laser sight. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you strain to hear because you know missing even a single word would be a mistake. "Grandma," she repeated, and the word came out flat, emotionless, a simple statement of fact. "You called me Grandma." It wasn't a question. Sharon opened her mouth, some instinct for self-preservation finally kicking in too late, far too late. "I didn't mean," she started. Judge Judy raised one finger, just one, and Sharon's words died in her throat like she'd been switched off. The power of that single gesture was absolute. The entire courtroom watched as this woman who'd been so loud, so aggressive, so certain of herself just moments ago, was silenced by nothing more than a raised finger and a look that could freeze nitrogen. Judge Judy set the glasses down on her desk with a soft click that somehow sounded final, like a door closing, like a coffin lid settling into place. She leaned back in her chair, her hands coming together in front of her, fingers steepled in that universal gesture of someone about to deliver judgment. Her face was still calm, still professional, but there was something else there now, something that made even the cameramen adjust their positions to make sure they captured every microsecond of what was coming. This wasn't anger. Anger was hot, explosive, temporary. This was something colder, more calculated, more devastating. This was disappointment mixed with absolute certainty, the expression of someone who'd seen this exact brand of foolishness 1,000 times before, and had long ago lost any patience for it. Sharon's lawyer had given up any pretense of professional composure. He'd turned slightly away from his client, his briefcase held in front of him like a shield, and his eyes were fixed on some point on the far wall, as if by not looking at the disaster unfolding beside him, he could somehow not be associated with it. His career was flashing before his eyes, every decision that had led to this moment being reevaluated and found catastrophically wanting. Marcus Chen, for his part, had the expression of a man watching a building collapse in slow motion. He didn't look triumphant or pleased. He looked almost sad. The way you feel sad when you see someone hurt themselves through their own stupidity. His lawyer had closed her folder. The documents inside no longer necessary because this case wasn't going to be decided on surveys or property law anymore. This case was already over. It had been over the moment Sharon said that word. The audience was transfixed. Not a single person was checking their phone, whispering to their neighbor or showing any of the usual signs of distraction. They were all locked in, watching Judge Judy's face, waiting for the explosion, for the verbal destruction, for the moment that they'd tell their friends about later. Some had their hands over their mouths. Others were leaning so far forward they were practically out of their seats. A few had that wide-eyed look of people watching a horror movie, knowing something terrible is about to happen but unable to look away. Judge Judy's mouth moved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the ghost of a smile, a distant cousin of amusement that had no warmth in it whatsoever. It was the expression of a chess master who'd just seen their opponent make a fatal blunder. The look of someone who knew they'd already won and was now just deciding how much they wanted their opponent to suffer. She tilted her head slightly to one side, studying Sharon the way a scientist might study a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. The gesture was almost curious, like she was genuinely fascinated by the level of stupidity on display before her. How, the tilt seemed to ask, how do people like you even function in the world? Sharon had gone pale under her heavy makeup, the foundation suddenly looking like a mask, artificial and cracking. A bead of sweat had formed at her temple. Her breathing had gone shallow and rapid. And in her eyes finally was the dawning realization that she'd walked into a lion's den and slapped the lion across the face. Judge Judy drew in a slow breath, her chest rising and falling with deliberate control. And when she spoke, the first word came out soft as silk and sharp as a razor blade. Sweetheart. The word came out like honey laced with arsenic, sweet on the surface but deadly underneath. Judge Judy let it hang there for a moment. Let Sharon hear the condescension dripping from every syllable. Let her understand that she was about to be educated in a way she'd never forget. Let me tell you something about this, Grandma. Judge Judy's voice remained quiet, controlled, but there was steel running through every word now, an edge that cut without needing volume. This Grandma graduated from American University in 1963. This Grandma got her law degree from New York Law School. This Grandma spent 14 years as a family court prosecutor in New York, handling cases you couldn't even imagine in your worst nightmares. Child abuse cases, custody battles, domestic violence, life and death situations where my decisions actually mattered. Sharon's face had gone from pale to gray. the color draining away like water down a sink. Her mouth opened slightly but no sound came out. Her hands, still twisted together at her waist, had started trembling. And this grandma, Judge Judy continued, her voice gaining momentum like a train building speed, spent another 14 years as a supervising judge in family court before I ever stepped foot in front of a television camera. Do you know how many cases I presided over in those 14 years? Do you have any concept of the number of lives I affected? The families I helped? The criminals I put away? The children I protected? Sharon shook her head, a tiny movement barely visible. No, Judge Judy answered for her. No, you don't, because you didn't do your homework. You walked into my courtroom with your frivolous lawsuit and your entitled attitude, and you didn't bother to learn who you were talking to. The words were landing like body blows, each one precisely aimed, each one devastating. Sharon's lawyer had actually taken a step away from her, physically distancing himself, and his face had gone red with secondhand humiliation. Judge Judy reached down and picked up Sharon's case file, holding it up between two fingers like it was contaminated. You're suing your neighbor for $5,000, she said, her voice dripping with disdain, because you think his fence is 6 inches onto your property. You think, based on measurements you took yourself with a tape measure from Home Depot. She paused, letting that sink in. You didn't hire a surveyor. You didn't get a professional assessment. You didn't do any of the things that someone with even a basic understanding of property law would do. You measured it yourself and decided you were right. And then, she continued, her voice dropping even lower, more dangerous, you had the unmitigated gall, the sheer audacity, to walk into my courtroom and insult my age, my experience, my credentials, and my competence. The temperature in the room had dropped 20 degrees. People in the gallery were holding their breath, afraid that even breathing too loudly would break the spell, would interrupt this masterclass in verbal destruction. But here's what you didn't know, Judge Judy said, and now there was something almost like satisfaction in her voice. The pleasure of someone about to reveal a devastating trump card. Mr. Chen's lawyer, would you please present your evidence? Marcus Chen's lawyer stepped forward smoothly, professionally, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. She handed a document to the bailiff, who brought it to Judge Judy's bench. Judge Judy glanced at it, that same ghost of a smile returning to her face. This, she said, holding up the document so Sharon could see it, is a professional survey conducted by a licensed surveyor 3 weeks ago. It shows that Mr. Chen's fence is not 6 inches onto your property. In fact, it shows that the fence is 2 feet, that's 24 inches for those of you who failed mathematics, 2 feet inside Mr. Chen's property line. The courtroom erupted, not in cheers or applause but in gasps, whispers, the sound of 50 people simultaneously realizing they were watching someone's entire world collapse. Sharon's face went from gray to white, completely bloodless. Her knees actually buckled slightly, and she had to grab the podium to steady herself. Which means, Judge Judy continued, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife through butter, that you didn't just waste this court's time. You didn't just insult me. You filed a completely fraudulent lawsuit, based on measurements you pulled out of thin air. Measurements that any competent person would have verified before dragging your neighbor to court. Sharon tried to speak, her mouth working soundlessly, her brain clearly scrambling for any possible explanation, any way to salvage this situation. But Judge Judy wasn't done. Not even close. And let me tell you something else, she said, leaning forward again, her eyes boring into Sharon's soul. In my 25 years on television, I've presided over more than 12,000 cases. That's 12,000 litigants who came through these doors, 12,000 disputes, 12,000 opportunities for people to lie to me, manipulate me, or underestimate me. Sharon was crying now, tears streaming down her face, cutting paths through her foundation, her mascara starting to run in black streaks. Her whole body was shaking. Her lawyer had turned completely away, facing the wall, his shoulders hunched in defeat. And do you know how many of those 12,000 people successfully played me for a fool? Judge Judy asked, her voice suddenly conversational, almost friendly. Sharon shook her head, unable to speak. 0, Judge Judy said softly. Not a single one. Because this grandma, she emphasized the word with razor-sharp precision, has forgotten more about human nature, about the law, about truth and lies and justice than you will learn in 10 lifetimes. The courtroom was absolutely still. Everyone frozen in place, watching this systematic dismantling of another human being's ego, not with joy, but with the kind of horrified fascination you can't look away from. Because Sharon had walked in here thinking she was clever, thinking she could win through intimidation and volume, and instead she'd run headfirst into a force of nature that had been honing its skills for more than half a century. Judge Judy set the survey down on her bench with deliberate care, like she was setting aside a weapon she no longer needed. And now, she said, her voice returning to that deadly quiet, we're going to talk about what happens when you waste my time and insult my intelligence in my courtroom. Judge Judy picked up her pen, the same pen she'd been using to take notes before Sharon had blown up her own life, and tapped it twice against the desk. The sound echoed in the silent courtroom like a countdown timer. "Your case is dismissed," she said, the words falling like stones. "Not only are you not getting $5,000, you're going to pay Mr. Chen $2,500 for court costs, and for wasting his time having to defend himself against your fantasy lawsuit." Sharon let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Her lawyer's shoulders slumped even further, if that was possible. But Judge Judy's hand came up again, that same single finger, because she wasn't finished. "Not by a long shot. And let me tell you why you really lost today," she said, her voice shifting into something different now. Not angry anymore, not cutting, but firm, like a teacher delivering a lesson that needed to be learned. "You lost because you thought being loud made you right. You thought if you just pushed hard enough, if you just acted entitled enough, if you just dismissed everyone around you as beneath you, that somehow reality would bend to your will." She paused, letting that sink in, her eyes moving from Sharon to the audience and back again. "That's not how the world works. That's not how the law works. And that's certainly not how my courtroom works." Sharon was sobbing openly now, her hands covering her face, her whole body shaking with the weight of her humiliation. Marcus Chen stood quietly at his podium, his expression a mixture of relief and something that looked almost like sympathy. Because despite everything she'd put him through, despite the harassment and the frivolous lawsuit and the 18 months of hell, he wasn't the kind of man who took pleasure in watching another person break down. "You walked in here and saw an old woman," Judge Judy continued, and her voice carried that same dangerous softness again. "You thought my age made me weak. You thought my experience made me outdated. You thought you could bully me the way you probably bullied everyone else in your life. The cashier at the grocery store, the person at the DMV, your neighbors, your co-workers, anyone who couldn't fight back." She leaned forward one final time, her face serious, her words measured and deliberate. "But here's what you need to understand, and here's what everyone watching needs to understand. Respect isn't about age. It's not about how you look or how loud you talk or how much attitude you bring into a room. Respect is earned through your actions, through your integrity, through showing up day after day and doing the right thing even when no one is watching." The courtroom was hanging on every word, people nodding slightly, some wiping their own eyes because the lesson had transcended the case, had become something bigger than one entitled woman and her foolish lawsuit. "I've spent 50 years earning respect," Judge Judy said quietly. 50 years of hard work, of studying, of fighting for justice, of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. I didn't demand respect. I didn't bully people into giving it to me. I earned it. And no amount of insults from people like you can take that away." She picked up her gavel, holding it loosely in her hand. "We're done here," she said, her voice returning to its professional tone. "Case dismissed. Judgment for the defendant." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that felt like a period at the end of a sentence. Final and absolute. "Get out of my courtroom." Sharon stumbled away from the podium, her lawyer practically carrying her toward the exit, her sobs still audible even as they left. Marcus Chen nodded respectfully to Judge Judy, a small gesture of gratitude that she acknowledged with the slightest inclination of her head. And as the courtroom began to breathe again, as the tension finally started to release, everyone present knew they'd just witnessed something more than a case being decided. They'd witnessed a masterclass in dignity, in earned authority, in what real power looks like when it doesn't need to shout. Within 20 minutes of the episode airing, the clip had exploded across every social media platform on the internet. Twitter was on fire with the hashtag Judge Judy Destroys Karen trending #1 worldwide, racking up over 2 million tweets in the first hour alone. The video clip had been viewed 18 million times by the end of the day. Comments flooded in from every corner of the globe. "She literally ended her with facts and dignity." One tweet read, shared 40,000 times. Another said, "This is what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness," accompanied by a clip of Sharon's face going pale. TikTok creators were making reaction videos, their faces showing genuine shock at the moment Sharon called Judge Judy grandma, and then absolute delight at the systematic destruction that followed. Instagram was filled with quote graphics, Judge Judy's words about earning respect overlaid on images of her stern but fair expression. Legal analysts on news networks were calling it a masterclass in courtroom control. Even lawyers who'd never appeared on television were sharing the clip in their professional groups, using it as an example of how authority combined with preparation creates unstoppable force. The lesson had transcended entertainment and become a cultural moment about respect, experience, and the cost of underestimating people based on superficial judgments. Judge Judy taught everyone watching that day a lesson far more valuable than any small claims verdict. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need volume or threats or insults. It sits quietly, armed with decades of experience, waiting for fools to reveal themselves. Sharon Berkowitz learned the hardest way possible that respect isn't demanded. It's earned through years of showing up, doing the work, and proving your worth through action, not words. And somewhere right now there's another Karen watching this video, about to make the same mistake, about to underestimate the wrong person, about to learn that true strength never needs to shout. If this story reminded you why Judge Judy is a legend, hit that subscribe button right now, because we bring you the most satisfying moments of justice every single week. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever witnessed someone get humbled like Sharon did? Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that experience and wisdom will always triumph over arrogance and entitlement. Thanks for watching, and remember, the loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. Real power speaks softly and carries the receipts. See you in the next one.